Hey guys, tonight we begin with a gentle stroll back through time, not to the roaring chaos of revolution or the excitement of epic battles, but to the kind of ordinary days that your great-grandparents might have vaguely remembered if they weren't too busy, dying of the flu or paying their bills. So, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, maybe grab a warm blanket, and let's float into the America of 1925. Now, the thing about this period is that it looks familiar in photographs. People wearing suits, women in dresses, kids with serious expressions, but it's actually a completely alien world if you try to imagine living there. Cars were around, sure, but mostly owned by people who could afford them. The rest of the population relied on horses, streetcars, and the occasional bicycle. Imagine commuting to work not with podcasts or Spotify, but by listening to the clip-clop of a horse on cobblestone streets. Charming in a vaguely backbreaking way. Let's start with the cities, because, of course, cities are where all the fun barely happens. New York, Chicago, and Boston were bustling, but bustling in the 1920s is a very different thing than bustling today. Skyscrapers were growing like weeds, because why not build taller when everyone else is still figuring out indoor plumbing? The Empire State Building was still under construction, but the Flatiron and Woolworth buildings were already trying to impress pedestrians who had, let's be honest, nowhere else to go. Streets were crowded with streetcars that smelled vaguely of coal, and cars that were often just a slightly louder, smokier horse carriage. The people in these cities were navigating a strange mix of old and new. Ladies still wore corsets because posture was very important if you wanted to look like a fragile Victorian ghost. Men wore hats and suits for going to the corner store, and everyone smoked, because nothing says health like filling your lungs with carcinogenic smoke before breakfast. Yes, breakfast. Cornflakes were new, but still a bit of a luxury, so many families stuck to oatmeal, or, for those who could afford it, eggs cooked in fat, because cholesterol was a concern only for the very rich. Now, outside the cities, life slowed down considerably. In small towns and rural areas, electricity was still a novelty. Some houses had it, many didn't. Gas lamps and candles were your primary light sources, which meant that evenings were long, quiet, and probably full of people thinking about taxes or how to milk the cow without falling into the manure pit. Baths were infrequent and often strategic. If you lived on a farm, a weekly bath might be considered generous, with water heated over a wood stove, which sounds relaxing until you remember it required about an hour of labor just to get the water hot. Schools were a mix of novelty and tedium. Compulsory education was spreading, but it wasn't universal. Some children still left school early to work on the farm or in factories, because obviously life required hands more than minds. Classrooms were strict, with teachers wielding rulers as casually as they handed out arithmetic problems. Children were expected to sit still, be polite, and memorize multiplication tables, while daydreaming about the next holiday, which for most meant a trip to a relative's farm or a very underwhelming fair. Let's pause here and think about the technology, or rather the gentle lack thereof. The radio had just started to creep into homes, offering a new kind of magic, voices and music delivered without a singer showing up in your parlor. Families would gather around these wooden boxes, listening to orchestras, weather forecasts, or soap operas that were slightly more exciting than watching paint dry, but only slightly. Telephones existed, but they were often shared with neighbors or tucked away in the hall, and long-distance calls were a luxury that could make you faint at the cost. And then there was the fashion, which, if we're honest, is one of the most visually amusing things to a modern eye. Women in flapper dresses were just starting to appear in cities, shaking their bobbed hair in ways that horrified the older generation. Corsets, stockings, and cloche hats contrasted sharply with the men in stiff suits and bowler hats who looked perpetually ready for a funeral, even if they were just heading to the corner to buy bread. Shoes were clunky, fabrics were heavy, and socks were apparently optional, depending on your level of self-respect. Food, of course, was a complicated affair. Urban markets offered fresh bread, meat, and some vegetables, but refrigeration was rare. Ice boxes, which were just insulated boxes with blocks of ice inside, were the closest thing to modern fridges, and yes, they leaked sometimes. Many families relied on local dairies and butcher shops, or, if they were ambitious, grew what they could in small backyard gardens. Eating out existed, but it was a modest affair. Diners, cafes, and soda fountains that doubled as social hubs for teenagers practicing the latest dance craze they had no rhythm for. Meanwhile, newspapers were king. Everyone read them. Headlines screamed about scandals, politics, and crime. If you were literate, you spent a good part of the morning poring over newsprint that smelled vaguely of ink and ambition. Children learned to read using primers that were cheerfully dull, but somehow this contributed to a populace that could discuss in detail the political missteps of local aldermen or the latest stock market movements. Speaking of stock markets, we should gently float toward the economy, which was in a peculiar state of optimism. The 1920s were for many Americans a time of mild prosperity. People bought cars, radios, and even early versions of washing machines. Consumer culture was spreading, with department stores offering everything from hats to sewing machines, to a slightly overcooked optimism about the future. Credit was a new thing, so families could purchase goods they didn't technically have the money for, which would later become, well, a bigger problem than anyone realized. Transportation is worth a slow note here. Cars like the Ford Model T were becoming common, but roads weren't quite there yet. Many rural roads were dirt paths that turned into sticky mud in the rain, making car travel an adventure of patience and slow sliding. Urban streets had traffic, but not in the chaotic sense we know today, more of a polite shuffle, occasionally punctuated by a horse bolting or a streetcar conductor shouting instructions to pedestrians who didn't know they had to obey them. Social life revolved around slow rhythms. Church attendance was high, partly because religion was important, but also because it was one of the few ways to gather socially without needing to invent a new social media app. Local fairs, picnics, and town meetings provided entertainment, which, let's be honest, was mostly a polite way of making small talk and wondering who had the biggest cow. Movies were just becoming a serious pastime. Silent films dominated, with live piano accompaniment in theaters providing the soundtrack to melodrama that was sometimes thrilling but mostly comforting in its predictability. Finally, let's consider health and hygiene ever so gently. Doctors existed, but antibiotics were decades away, and hospitals were somewhat scary places. Vaccines were just starting to become common for some diseases, but influenza had recently reminded everyone that death was still a quiet companion at every turn. People managed with home remedies, advice from neighbors, and the occasional patent medicine that promised to cure everything from fatigue to bad dreams. So, there we have it, America a century ago. Streets filled with a mix of horses and cars, children learning multiplication tables under the strict gaze of teachers, women in hats that could double as satellite dishes, and families gathering around radios to hear orchestras play music that felt like the future. Life was slow, measured, and oddly comforting if you didn't mind a little grime, a little hunger, and a lot of social expectations. Let's float over to another corner of the country next, where life in small towns created a completely different rhythm. Here, mornings started with roosters rather than alarm clocks. Children helped with chores before school, and dinner was a strategic event where everyone had to eat efficiently because the cook had other tasks waiting. Houses were simple but cozy.
Fires burned steadily in stoves, and families valued practical clothing over fashion, which meant a lot of patched trousers and dresses that had been handed down for generations. Evenings were slow and deliberate. With no TV and limited radio, entertainment was largely improvised. Families played cards, read books, or simply talked. And when night fully arrived, darkness enveloped everything, making sleep a luxury, but also a welcome escape from the monotony and labor of the day.
All right, so we've settled into the slow rhythm of daily life in 1925 America. Streets, chores, baths that take hours. But let's drift gently towards something slightly more entertaining. Leisure. Because even a world of horse-drawn buggies and strict teachers needs a few tiny sparks of distraction. Leisure in 1925 was an exercise in patience, imagination, and occasionally mild excitement. City folks could go to movie theaters. Yes, silent films were still king, though talkies were beginning to creep onto the horizon, promising voices that were perfectly monotone and somewhat awkwardly synchronized. Imagine sitting in a dark theater, watching actors move dramatically while someone pounds away on a piano in the corner. The occasional gasp or sniffle from the audience was the height of communal entertainment. And if you were really fancy, the theater might have an organ, not a full orchestra, just an organ, loudly reminding everyone that life was both serious and slightly tedious. Teenagers were emerging as a distinct social group. Adolescence was still a new concept, and they were experimenting with clothing, dancing, and hairstyles that horrified their parents. Flappers were perhaps the most infamous example. Young women bobbing their hair, shortening their dresses just enough to scandalize their elders, and, gasp, smoking in public. The subtle rebellion here was charming in a sleepy, almost polite way. Meanwhile, young men sported slicked-back hair, ties, and jackets, trying to look like they belonged in a magazine, even if their only talent was whistling poorly while walking down the street. Soda fountains became social hubs, especially in towns and small cities. Teens would linger over ice cream sodas, occasionally dipping into a bit of harmless gossip. Adults weren't entirely thrilled, but the novelty of cold sugar drinks in glass cups was irresistible. For many, the soda fountain was the first introduction to the thrill of spending money on something completely unnecessary, which, in retrospect, was excellent practice for the future horrors of consumer culture. For the slightly older crowd, parks offered a quiet, gentle escape. Families would stroll, children would play on swings that creaked ominously, and men occasionally tested their patience on worn benches while contemplating the endless monotony of life. Baseball was becoming America's favorite pastime, though mostly in a polite, predictable way. Local teams played in modest stadiums where crowds clapped politely and cheered quietly because yelling too much was considered undignified. Let's drift toward fashion again for a moment, because style is always mildly amusing in retrospect. Women's flapper dresses were one thing, but the everyday wardrobe remained strictly functional. Long skirts, stockings, and hats dominated, while gloves were not optional, they were required for any sense of respectability. Men's fashion revolved around suits, waistcoats, and hats. Every man in a city looked slightly like he might faint at the sight of a cockroach, which, given the state of urban hygiene, was entirely reasonable. Food remained a delicate balance between practicality and indulgence. Ice boxes continued their slow conquest of kitchens, keeping perishables vaguely fresh. Families relied on markets, dairies, and homegrown vegetables.
Baking was both a necessity and a hobby, often yielding bread that was sometimes edible and sometimes better suited for hammering nails. Canning was popular because storing fruits and vegetables in jars promised a sense of accomplishment and mildly increased survival odds through the winter. Let's pause to imagine a day in a small town. Morning begins with chores, milking cows, fetching water, feeding chickens, and occasionally checking the mailbox for the weekly newspaper. School might take up the late morning and early afternoon, with students walking several miles if they were lucky enough to have shoes that fit. After school, work continued, helping on the farm, assisting in a local shop, or performing the occasional task for neighbors. Then, as the sun dipped low, families gathered for dinner. Conversation was polite, occasionally interrupted by a sneeze or a minor spat over who got the last piece of bread. Evenings, as we mentioned before, were unhurried. With no TV and minimal radio, people found their own entertainment. Reading was common, though books were still luxury items for some. Games like cards or checkers allowed families to connect, though usually at a slow, measured pace. And if someone was particularly ambitious or restless, they might take a stroll around town, greeting neighbors in a fashion that was half formal, half obligatory. Technology was creeping in, but ever so slowly. Telephones existed, but few households had them. Long-distance calls were rare, expensive, and sometimes involved shouting across switchboards to get connected. Radios were beginning to dominate evenings, bringing music, news, and serialized dramas into living rooms. Families would sit together, listening to orchestras, lectures, or the occasional commercial for patent medicine that promised vaguely to make life better. Let's float over to the topic of work. For most adults, life involved steady, repetitive labor. Factories in cities demanded long hours with few breaks. Factory workers were often tired, slightly cranky, and mildly fascinated by the strange new contraptions they operated. Rural workers had their own rhythm, dictated by sunrise, weather, and the relentless needs of animals. Whether in city or country, work was unavoidable, and a polite dose of fatigue was considered normal by all parties. Now, transportation deserves a bit more attention. Cars were becoming more common, thanks largely to Ford's assembly line innovations, but roads weren't fully developed. Dirt roads turned into mud baths when it rained, making travel slow and occasionally humiliating. Streetcars persisted in cities, clattering along tracks with a somewhat polite determination. Horses still existed, mainly for those who either preferred them or couldn't yet afford a car, and bicycles offered an occasional thrill for those nimble enough to avoid pedestrians and manure alike. Crime, surprisingly, was mostly mundane. Pickpocketing, small-time theft, and occasional bootlegging provided gentle excitement for those with particularly vivid imaginations. Police forces existed, but often functioned more as polite observers than the dramatic enforcers we imagine from fiction. And prohibition was, of course, in full swing, creating quiet opportunities for people to sip something stronger than coffee in the comfort of a friend's basement. Let's drift to hospitals, health, and general human frailty. Doctors were available, though medical knowledge was limited. Antibiotics were decades away, so minor infections could linger annoyingly. Influenza was a recent, not-so-fun memory, and vaccinations were becoming more common but were still limited. Home remedies persisted, ranging from mildly effective teas to dubious patent concoctions that promised to cure anything from fatigue to bad dreams. Life was delicate, but Americans carried on, generally with calm acceptance. Public spaces like libraries, post offices, and markets were quiet epicenters of daily life. People checked mail, borrowed books, and purchased goods, all with a sense of calm purpose. Libraries offered a gentle retreat into literature, with librarians maintaining a quiet vigilance over the orderly shelves. Post offices ensured communication, though slower and more deliberate than we are used to. Markets were lively but measured, with customers haggling softly over produce, meat, or household goods. And of course, we can't forget the mild excitement of innovation. Washing machines were slowly arriving in middle-class homes, promising relief from tedious laundry routines. Refrigerators were still aspirational, but iceboxes persisted. Cars were spreading, slowly transforming how Americans perceived distance, leisure, and fashion, and radios, slowly but surely, were reshaping evenings, providing a gentle hum of entertainment in every home that could afford one. Finally, consider the political backdrop, lightly and sleepily. Presidents came and went, legislation passed in Congress affecting taxes, infrastructure, and commerce. Citizens voted, sometimes enthusiastically, sometimes with polite resignation. Political scandals existed, but rarely intruded on the calm rhythm of daily existence, unless you were particularly invested in newspapers or gossip.
All right, friends, let's continue our gentle wander through 1925 America. We've glimpsed streets, schools, farms, and the quiet hum of radio evenings. Now let's float between rural and urban life a bit more, noticing the subtle contrasts that made each corner of the country slightly peculiar in its own way. Urban life had its peculiar rhythm. City dwellers woke to the clatter of streetcars, the occasional barking dog, and the polite honk of a Model T trying to squeeze through narrow streets. Breakfast might be coffee, toast, and perhaps eggs if one was ambitious or particularly well off. Parents dressed children carefully, often in outfits that looked more like uniforms than casual wear, because in the city, appearances mattered. Then the day rolled along, work, school, errands, all punctuated by the occasional mild inconvenience, like a delay in the streetcar or a horse-dropping surprise on the sidewalk. Rural life, by contrast, moved with the sun. The rooster's crow was far more effective than any alarm clock. Children helped with chores before school, fed chickens, milked cows, and perhaps delivered eggs or milk to neighbors as a mild form of exercise. After chores, school might take them miles away, walking along dirt roads that were sticky or dusty depending on the weather. The pace was slower, the expectations different, and the landscape itself, fields, forests, rivers, offered a quiet backdrop to daily labor that city children could only glimpse in books or postcards. Entertainment, as ever, was both minimal and oddly charming. In cities, movie theaters provided silent films with live piano accompaniment, creating a soundtrack that was sometimes thrilling, often slightly off-key. Outside cities, theaters were less common, and community gatherings, church socials, picnics, and small-town fairs dominated leisure time. Sports like baseball were enjoyed politely. Towns cheered without frenzy, and crowds sat patiently in modest stands, occasionally breaking into polite applause when a ball cleared the infield. Dancing was an occasional delight for both city and country. In urban areas, flappers practiced their new dances, creating gentle scandal for parents. In rural towns, barn dances and community halls offered similar rhythms, though with slightly more modest steps and an emphasis on polite formality. Music might come from a gramophone, a fiddle, or a piano if someone was particularly ambitious.
Dancing was as much about socializing as movement, and stepping on toes was considered a minor tragedy, not an opportunity for viral fame. Let's talk about early consumer culture, because this is where things get quietly interesting. Department stores were spreading, particularly in cities. They sold everything from hats to household goods to small luxuries that promised to make life easier or slightly more fashionable. Catalogs arrived in the mail, offering Americans a curated window into desires they might not have known they had. The Sears catalog, for example, could turn a quiet afternoon into a daydream of tools, clothing, and slightly impractical furniture. Credit systems were emerging too, encouraging people to spend money they didn't have, a gentle nudge toward financial tension that would eventually bloom spectacularly in the coming decades. Food shopping in urban markets was a sensory, slightly chaotic experience. Bakers displayed bread that was fresh but occasionally dense. Butchers offered meat, though preservation was always a concern. Vegetables were seasonal, and iceboxes kept perishables just cold enough to be safe, though leaks and smells were common. Rural families, in contrast, relied on homegrown produce, preserved goods, and the occasional market trip. Daily meals were practical, filling, and often repetitive, though tastefully seasoned with whatever herbs, fats, or sugar one could obtain. Children's routines were equally methodical. School dominated mornings and early afternoons, but play still had a gentle presence. Games were simple: marbles, hopscotch, tag, or improvised toys made from scraps. Imagination was essential because options were limited and electronic distractions were non-existent. After school, chores often resumed, sometimes lasting until dusk. Evening routines were slow, meals were family-centered, and lights were dim, creating a sense of tranquility that modern homes rarely achieve. Health and medicine deserve another quiet mention. Doctors existed, but they were calm, deliberate, and not particularly omnipotent. Minor injuries and illnesses were handled at home, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Hospitals were not the high-tech institutions we imagine today. They were often intimidating, antiseptic, and slightly uncomfortable places where people went when no other option existed. Public health campaigns were emerging, vaccinations, hygiene instruction, but progress was slow, requiring patience from citizens who had a lot to do during the day already. Technology crept into life gently. Telephones, while still limited, allowed families to communicate more efficiently than letters. Radios brought music, news, and drama into living rooms, offering a soft background hum that was comforting in its predictability. Cars began reshaping travel, though roads were still inconsistent, creating mild adventures for drivers who dared leave city streets. Electricity spread slowly, bringing light and appliances to homes that previously relied on gas lamps or wood stoves. Let's not forget social etiquette, because it dominated daily life quietly, almost invisibly. Greetings were formal but polite. Neighbors checked on each other without intrusion, and everyone had an understanding of personal space and responsibility. Missteps, wearing the wrong hat, speaking out of turn, or failing to tip a delivery boy properly, were met with mild disapproval, not explosive outrage. Life was orderly, predictable, and slow-moving, which is precisely what made it so sleep-inducing in retrospect. We can gently drift toward politics and public discourse now. Newspapers remained central to information. Daily reading was common. Headlines informed citizens of everything from local council debates to international affairs. People followed political campaigns with polite interest, sometimes debating quietly at home or in cafes. Corruption existed, naturally, but it was a slow-moving, bureaucratic sort of corruption, not the sensationalized, 24-hour scandal culture we experience today. Voting was a civic duty, participated in with calm deliberation, and often involved waiting in line and exchanging polite pleasantries with fellow citizens. Education also bore reflection. Schools taught basic literacy, arithmetic, geography, and civics, with an emphasis on rote memorization and strict classroom behavior. Teachers enforced rules with rulers or sharp looks, and children internalized these lessons with quiet compliance. Higher education was accessible to some, though not widespread. Universities existed, but life remained grounded in practicality. Few students were there to experiment. Most were there to prepare for careers that would sustain themselves and their families. Work, leisure, health, education, these rhythms intertwined seamlessly, creating a gentle tapestry of life. Even minor inconveniences like a broken streetcar or a muddy road became expected interruptions, accepted with calm resignation. Daily life in 1925 was deliberate, predictable, and quietly fascinating if you observed it with patience. Finally, let's drift slowly toward the idea of societal change. America in 1925 was at the cusp of transformation. Women's suffrage had passed just a few years prior. Cities were growing. Technology was quietly advancing. But for most citizens, these changes were gentle waves rather than tsunamis. Life remained a calm, measured pace, punctuated by minor curiosities, seasonal work, and the occasional excitement of a new invention or public event. Evenings concluded with calm reflection. Families gathered around lamps or early electric lights, listening to the radio, reading, or quietly conversing. Streets emptied. Horses were stabled. Cars parked.
All right, let's drift a little deeper into 1925 America, focusing on the quieter joys and routines that filled the hours between chores, school, and work. We've covered streets, farms, schools, and radio evenings, but there's a lot more subtle flavor to daily life, especially when it comes to entertainment, shopping, and the gentle rhythms of seasons and holidays. City entertainment in the 1920s had a gentle elegance to it, if elegance is defined as sitting quietly in a darkened theater while a piano hammers out the emotional highs of a silent film. Movie theaters were modestly opulent in some areas, plush seats, velvet curtains, chandeliers that probably required more cleaning than anyone enjoyed. But most screenings were simply about escaping into moving pictures for an hour or two. Comedies, melodramas, and occasional travelogues transported viewers to places they might never see without needing to leave their sticky floors or clattering streetcars. For those slightly more adventurous or socially daring, dance halls and ballrooms offered a way to stretch legs, socialize, and gently scandalize older generations. The Charleston, foxtrot, and other dances were performed with carefully measured enthusiasm. Flappers bobbed their hair and shook their fringes, while young men struggled to maintain balance and decorum, occasionally colliding politely with each other. In small towns, barn dances provided similar experiences, with fiddles or pianos supplying music and teens learning the delicate art of looking coordinated while stepping on toes only occasionally. Department stores deserved their own slow, deliberate reflection. They were a new kind of magic in urban life. Large windows displayed dresses, hats, kitchenware, and toys, drawing pedestrians into aisles that smelled faintly of polish, ink, and ambition. Escalators were just beginning to appear, terrifying older shoppers while delighting the adventurous.
Cashiers handled transactions with calm efficiency, and sales clerks answered questions politely, often with a faint air of mild superiority, because they were the gatekeepers of goods that many customers could barely afford. Catalog shopping extended this quiet magic to rural homes. The Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs were like tiny treasure troves, each page filled with products that promised to simplify life or provide small luxuries. Children would flip through them with wide-eyed fascination, while adults occasionally daydreamed about ordering something slightly impractical, like a piano, a new stove, or a set of ornamental knives that would mostly sit in the drawer, admired for their potential rather than practical use. Food and drink played an essential, if gentle, role in leisure. Soda fountains were social hubs where teenagers and adults could sip ice cream sodas, malted milk drinks, or coffee, exchanging polite gossip. Bakeries offered fragrant bread and pastries, while local markets displayed vegetables and fruits that were seasonal, fresh, and occasionally imperfect. Urban restaurants existed, mostly modest affairs, but visiting one could feel like a mini vacation from routine life, though still grounded in polite expectations of service and manners. Seasonal life was a rhythm that everyone knew and, in a strange way, relied on. Spring brought planting, cleaning, and mild optimism. Summer meant longer workdays, but also the occasional community fair, parade, or picnic. Autumn arrived with harvests, school routines, and preparations for winter, including preserving food, repairing clothing, and stacking wood. Winter was quieter, dominated by indoor work, reading, and reflection. Ice boxes and stoves were taxed more heavily during the cold months, but families managed with patience and careful planning, creating a sense of calm endurance that is hard to appreciate in modern life. Holidays were gentle celebrations, offering minor excitement without overwhelming chaos. 4th of July parades were orderly, fireworks were sparing, and local gatherings emphasized polite socializing over extravagance. Thanksgiving dinners were carefully prepared, meals shared quietly, and children occasionally received small treats rather than mountains of toys. Christmas was becoming increasingly commercialized, though slowly. Catalogs and department stores ensured that gift-giving was more deliberate than chaotic. Let's take a moment to drift toward children's daily routines. As we've touched on before, school occupied mornings and early afternoons, with play and chores filling the gaps. Toys were simple, often handmade or purchased from small stores. Imagination was a key part of play. Children created games from scraps, invented stories, and occasionally engaged in minor competitions that were resolved politely or sometimes with gentle tears. Outdoor play was dominant thanks to the lack of electronic distractions, and friendships were built on shared labor, games, and minor adventures around town or farm. Adults, meanwhile, maintained routines that were steady, predictable, and slightly repetitive. Work was mostly laborious but not frenetic. Factory shifts were long but orderly. Farm work was dictated by the sun and seasons. Shops and offices functioned on polite efficiency. Meals were structured, chores were completed with care, and evenings were devoted to quiet reflection, conversation, or mild entertainment. Life's excitement was subtle, found in small achievements, minor surprises, or the rare social event that warranted leaving the house. Religion retained its quiet but pervasive role. Church attendance was common, and sermons often blended morality with mild social commentary. Communities gathered around religious events, blending spiritual reflection with gentle social interaction. The calm order of faith complemented the daily routines of work, school, and household management, providing both structure and reassurance in an era where medical knowledge, technology, and comfort were steadily evolving, but far from ubiquitous. Health, as always, was a slow-moving concern. Doctors provided advice, remedies, and care, but many minor ailments were handled at home. Illnesses were met with patience, and recovery often required rest, simple nutrition, and time rather than medicine. Public health campaigns encouraged hygiene, vaccination, and disease prevention, but progress was gradual, relying on the adoption of new practices over weeks, months, or even years. Transportation, gently emphasized again, remained a crucial factor in daily life. Cars were spreading, but infrastructure was catching up slowly. Dirt roads, cobblestones, and early paved streets created challenges, while streetcars, bicycles, and horses remained essential for practical travel. Travel was deliberate, predictable, and slightly taxing, with minor mishaps, flat tires, mud, or miscommunications considered entirely normal. And so, as we drift toward the conclusion of Part 4, we see 1925 America as a landscape of slow rhythms, mild pleasures, and gentle routines. Cities were lively but not frenetic, small towns were orderly but not dull, and the entire country moved to the beat of work, chores, school, leisure, and the occasional minor excitement. The combination of emerging technology, early consumer culture, and the gentle pace of life created a world that feels distant yet strangely familiar, a perfect backdrop for calm reflection, slow storytelling, and perhaps a very deep
All right,
yawn.
friends, let's continue our unhurried journey through 1925 America. We've meandered through daily life, schools, chores, leisure, department stores, and seasonal routines. Now, let's float gently toward a quieter, yet subtly transformative part of life: radio, music, and the mild social curiosities that filled homes and towns. The radio was still relatively new in most households, but it had quickly become the evening companion everyone didn't quite realize they needed. Families gathered around bulky wooden boxes, listening to orchestras, lectures, or serialized dramas that promised a hint of adventure without requiring actual movement. The sound was occasionally tinny, sometimes off-key, and often completely misaligned with the story being told. But this only added to the charm. People adjusted their listening positions, occasionally fiddled with knobs, and nodded politely when someone commented on a particularly dramatic scene. Music was everywhere, though rarely overwhelming. Jazz was slowly creeping into urban parlors, though in small towns, piano, fiddle, or harmonica dominated. Record players were making tentative appearances, and sheet music filled the shelves of department stores, offering families the chance to attempt minor concerts in the living room. Children might tap along with mild enthusiasm, adults occasionally hummed, and neighbors could sometimes hear faint notes drifting through open windows. The experience was communal, gentle, and just slightly awkward, creating an oddly comforting atmosphere. Social dynamics, especially in small towns, were slow-moving but mildly intriguing. Gossip was the quiet entertainment of the day. Who borrowed sugar? Who had a new hat? Who was courting whom? These stories circulated with polite discretion, often growing in detail as they passed from neighbor to neighbor. No one shouted, no one panicked. It was a subtle game of observation, polite commentary, and mild judgment, which added an undercurrent of social structure to otherwise ordinary life. Community events punctuated the weeks. Church socials, fairs, picnics, and seasonal festivals offered predictable yet welcome interruptions to routine labor. People dressed carefully, participated with quiet enthusiasm, and returned home with minor tales to recount at dinner tables or across fences. Events were never chaotic, rarely spectacular, and almost always predictable. A rhythm that reinforced the steady pace of life rather than disturbing it.
The influence of automobiles on social life was significant, though subtle. Cars were spreading in cities and slowly appearing in towns, offering new opportunities for leisure and mild independence. A drive into the countryside could replace a long walk, and teens with access to cars found a gentle thrill in exploring streets and paths that had previously required effort and stamina. Roads were often rough, cars were slow, and breakdowns were mildly inconvenient, but these challenges added to the charm. Drivers learned patience, mechanical skill, and the art of politely apologizing to neighbors when horses were startled or mud splashed unexpectedly. Let's reflect for a moment on class and wealth. America of 1925 was neither equal nor particularly egalitarian, though the differences were more subtle than dramatic. Wealthier families in cities could afford radios, cars, department store clothes, and occasional luxuries. Middle-class families managed with careful budgeting, small indulgences, and patience. Rural families relied on their land, homegrown food, and barter networks, creating a lifestyle that was modest but self-sufficient. Class distinctions existed, certainly, but they often manifested in clothing quality, house size, or access to minor entertainment, rather than an outright separation or drama. Children's lives, as always, remained a mix of education, chores, and play. Schools taught reading, arithmetic, geography, and civics, emphasizing patience, obedience, and polite engagement. After school, children helped with household or farm tasks, played outdoors with minimal supervision, and occasionally engaged in small mischief that was noticed, gently scolded, and quickly forgotten. Toys were simple, homemade or purchased, and imagination filled in any gaps in excitement or narrative. Work remained steady, predictable, and somewhat repetitive. Factory shifts were long, office tasks methodical, and farm labor dictated by the sun and seasons. Men and women maintained routines with patience, occasionally breaking them for mild excursions to markets, fairs, or social events. Meals, chores, and personal grooming punctuated the day, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic in its regularity. Evenings often brought quiet reflection. Families gathered around radios or lamps, discussing events of the day in measured tones. Streets emptied, animals were fed and stabled, and the soft hum of distant traffic or streetcars provided a gentle soundtrack. Life moved slowly, predictably, and with a faint sense of communal continuity. Public spaces, libraries, markets, post offices remained hubs of polite activity. People exchanged news, borrowed books, or purchased goods with calm purpose. Social interactions were measured, deliberate, and slightly formal, providing gentle structure to the otherwise repetitive pace of daily life. Even minor disputes, like a misunderstanding over a borrowed item, were resolved with quiet negotiation rather than dramatic confrontation. Health and medicine continued their slow, unhurried influence. Doctors provided advice, remedies, and care, but recovery often depended more on rest and patience than advanced treatments. Home remedies persisted, ranging from mildly effective teas to vaguely magical patent concoctions. Hospitals existed, but were not central to daily life, often invoked only when simpler solutions had failed. Public health campaigns encouraged vaccination, hygiene, and disease prevention, but adaptation was gradual and unhurried. Education, as always, provided gentle structure. Schools reinforced literacy, arithmetic, and social norms. Teachers maintained discipline with rulers, sharp looks, or measured instructions. Higher education existed, but less common, often reserved for those with the resources, patience, or ambition to pursue it. Learning was deliberate, cumulative and mildly tedious, a gentle preparation for adulthood rather than a thrilling intellectual adventure. Transportation remained a recurring theme. Cars, streetcars, bicycles, and horses each occupied a role in daily life, offering predictable benefits and occasional mild frustrations. Roads were inconsistent, vehicles were slow and occasionally unreliable, and travel required patience, attention, and polite interaction with fellow citizens. Accidents were minor, disruptions were temporary, and people generally accepted these limitations with calm, almost meditative grace. So, as we drift toward the close of Part 5, picture a 1925 evening. Families gathered around radios, children gently playing with toys or reading, adults reflecting on the day, streets quieting, and towns settling into calm routines. Life was structured, repetitive, and comforting, filled with small curiosities, mild excitement, and gentle social dynamics. It's a world that seems distant yet familiar, predictable yet charming, slow yet filled with subtle rhythms that guided citizens through each day without stress, hurry, or the modern cacophony of constant news and notifications. It's a landscape made for calm observation, gentle storytelling, and the perfect backdrop for drifting
By
towards sleep.
1925, America had developed a fairly sturdy skeleton of civic life. Not flashy, not exciting, just quietly present, like a wooden desk that's been in the same office for 30 years and will remain there long after everyone forgets who bought it. Most Americans interacted with government in very small, manageable doses. You paid taxes, you voted if you felt inclined, and occasionally you complained about potholes. City halls existed mostly as buildings people walked past while running errands. They smelled faintly of paper, ink, and mild disappointment. Local government mattered far more than national politics to the average person. Town councils decided road repairs, school funding, and whether the new lamp post was absolutely necessary or just a waste of money. Meetings were sparsely attended. The same few citizens showed up every time. Everyone else trusted them to handle things or didn't think about it at all. Voting itself was a calm affair. You showed up, you stood in line, you marked your choice. There were no stickers, no social media posts, no dramatic declarations. You voted, nodded politely, and went home to make lunch. Newspapers were the true heartbeat of public life. Almost every household had at least one. They arrived folded, slightly damp with ink, and full of headlines that sounded urgent but rarely changed anyone's plans for the day. People read them slowly, over coffee, at breakfast, on benches, at work if the boss wasn't looking. The paper told you what mattered, what sort of mattered, and what absolutely did not matter but was printed anyway. Local news dominated. Who got married, who passed away, who was opening a new shop, who had been mildly arrested for something that would be politely discussed for weeks afterward. National news was important but distant. Presidents came and went in Washington, Congress argued, laws were passed. All of this existed in the background, like weather in a neighboring state. Advertising, meanwhile, was quietly embedding itself into daily life. Ads filled newspapers with confident promises, toothpaste that would fix your life, soap that would make you respectable, tonic that would restore vitality, courage, and possibly your marriage. Nobody questioned these claims too deeply. Advertising was new, and optimism was cheap. People trusted print. If it was in the paper, it felt official, or at least plausible enough to try once. Public health campaigns appeared in these same pages. Wash your hands, cover your cough, boil your water. Advice was offered calmly, without alarm. Progress happened slowly, because habits change slowly, especially when people are tired and already busy. Sanitation improved in cities, though unevenly. Trash collection existed, but schedules were flexible in the loosest sense of the word. Streets were swept,
Sewers functioned most of the time. When they didn't, everyone pretended it was temporary. Rural areas relied more on wells, outhouses, and personal responsibility. Cleanliness was practical, not aesthetic. You stayed healthy by doing your best and hoping nothing invisible decided otherwise. Public libraries were quiet pillars of community life. They offered books, newspapers, and silence. Librarians enforced rules gently but firmly. Reading was encouraged. Talking was discouraged. Everyone understood the arrangement. Schools operated with similar calm authority. Bells rang, lessons were taught, students listened or pretended to. Education was not framed as a journey of self-discovery. It was preparation. Learn this, memorize that, sit still. Teachers were respected, slightly feared, and rarely questioned. Parents trusted them, society supported them. Discipline was accepted as part of learning, not debated endlessly. Religion continued to shape civic rhythm without dominating it. Sundays slowed everything down. Churches filled, bells rang. Sermons offered moral guidance and gentle reminders to behave decently. Churches also served as social organizers. They hosted meetings, charity drives, and events that allowed people to interact without awkwardness. Faith was both belief and infrastructure. Workplaces reflected similar values. Punctuality mattered, reliability mattered, personality mattered less. You showed up, you did your job, you went home. Office workers typed, filed, and calculated. Factory workers assembled, inspected, and repeated. Farm workers planted and harvested and repaired. Pride came from consistency, not innovation. Lunch breaks were simple. Meals were packed, purchased nearby, or skipped with minimal complaint. Nobody optimized productivity. Nobody tracked steps. People worked, rested, and continued. Public transportation kept cities moving at a polite pace. Streetcars followed tracks. Conductors collected fares. Riders sat quietly, reading newspapers or staring forward with impressive commitment. Cars continued their slow takeover, but etiquette still mattered. Honking was restrained. Drivers waved apologies. Accidents were rare enough to be discussed in detail afterward. The Postal Service functioned like a quiet miracle. Letters arrived, packages arrived, communication moved steadily, predictably, and without instant gratification. People waited, and accepted waiting as normal. This patience extended to almost everything. Results took time. Change took time. Improvement happened gradually, without announcements. Even progress felt understated. A new road opened, a new school expanded, electricity reached another neighborhood. People nodded. Life continued. And that's perhaps the most striking thing about America in 1925. Not what happened, but how calmly it happened. No constant urgency, no endless alerts, just routines layered gently on top of one another, forming a society that moved forward without needing to convince itself it was special. As night settled in, newspapers were folded, lamps were lit, radios hummed quietly, streets emptied, buildings rested. Civic life paused until morning, and in that pause, in that quiet, predictable order, people slept deeply, ready to repeat it all again tomorrow.
Let's ease into something a little heavier, but not louder. No drama, no sharp turns, just the quiet realities everyone lived with and rarely questioned. America in 1925 liked rules, not written ones, the other kind, the kind everyone understood without ever talking about them. Social boundaries existed everywhere. They were invisible, firm, and enforced mostly through silence, glances, and the subtle art of "that's just how things are." Race was the most obvious line, and also the most carefully ignored by those who benefited from it. In much of the country, segregation wasn't debated, it was routine. Schools were separate, neighborhoods were separate, Restaurants, theaters, restrooms, and waiting rooms followed rules that required no signage for locals to understand. In the South, Jim Crow laws made these divisions official. In the North, segregation existed anyway, just quieter, unofficial, and politely denied. Black Americans lived parallel lives, same cities, same clocks, different access, different expectations, different risks. Daily life continued under these conditions with grim normalcy. People went to work, children went to school, families gathered for meals, all within a system designed to limit opportunity without needing to explain itself. Violence existed, but it didn't dominate daily conversation. Fear was quieter than that. It lived in routines, in decisions about where to go, who to speak to, and when to remain invisible. White Americans, meanwhile, often went about their lives without thinking much about it at all. Segregation was background noise, like weather, like gravity, present, unremarkable, unquestioned. Immigration added another layer of quiet division. Cities were filled with neighborhoods defined by origin, Italian blocks, Irish streets, Jewish quarters, Polish enclaves, each with its own shops, churches, languages, and social codes. These communities were vibrant, tight-knit, and often wary of outsiders. Immigrants worked hard, lived close together, and preserved traditions that made life feel familiar in a country that sometimes did not. Acceptance came slowly. Accents mattered, names mattered, religion mattered. Catholics were viewed with suspicion. Jews faced open discrimination. Eastern and Southern Europeans were considered new stock, watched carefully by those who believed America had already been perfected by earlier arrivals. Social clubs, workplaces, and neighborhoods often enforced quiet exclusion, no confrontation, just polite distance. "You wouldn't be comfortable here" was rarely spoken, but always understood. Women, too, lived within carefully drawn boundaries. The right to vote was new, but expectations remained.
Because if there was one place where 1925 America really showed its personality, it was inside the household, behind closed doors, lace curtains, and carefully managed appearances. Marriage was not optional in the cultural sense. It was expected, assumed, planned for early. Being unmarried past a certain age invited concern, speculation, and a steady stream of well-meaning advice. People didn't ask if you'd marry, they asked when. Courtship followed a predictable pattern. Introductions happened through family, church, or community. Dates were formal: walks, dinners, dances, church events, always public, always respectable. Privacy was limited. Chaperones hovered. Parents observed quietly. Reputation was guarded like a fragile heirloom. Romance existed, but it was restrained. Feelings were implied more than expressed. Love was something you discovered after marriage, not before, or so everyone said. Engagements were brief. Weddings were modest. Marriage followed quickly because that was the point. Building a life together mattered more than finding yourself. Once married, roles settled into place with impressive efficiency. Men worked. That was their job, their identity, their obligation. Whether they enjoyed it or not was mostly irrelevant. Women managed the home, cooking, cleaning, budgeting, child-rearing. Their labor was constant, unpaid, and rarely acknowledged as work. Housekeeping was not aesthetic, it was functional, clean enough, orderly enough, respectable enough. Meals were prepared daily. Laundry was relentless. Childcare never paused. Efficiency was learned quickly, or not at all. Houses were quiet during the day. Children at school, men at work, women alone with tasks and thoughts they rarely shared. Loneliness existed, but it wasn't discussed. It was folded neatly into routine. Children arrived early and often. Birth control was limited. Family size depended more on chance than planning. Pregnancy was handled practically. Home births were common. Doctors arrived late. Pain was endured quietly. Motherhood was idealized but exhausting. Infants cried. Toddlers wandered. Older children worked, helped, and learned responsibility early. Fathers were present but distant. Authority figures, providers. Emotional closeness was rare, not because it wasn't unwanted, but because it wasn't taught. Discipline was firm. Expectations were clear. Childhood was not centered on expression, but preparation. Meals were structured events. Everyone sat, everyone ate what was served. Complaints were discouraged.
Let's wander back into the classroom now. Gently. Try not to make noise, because in 1925, classrooms were places of order, and silence was considered a personality trait. School, 100 years ago, wasn't designed to be inspiring. It was designed to be effective, efficient, predictable, and mildly intimidating. Most school buildings were plain. Brick walls, tall windows, long hallways that smelled faintly of chalk, ink, and boiled vegetables from someone's lunch pail. Desks were bolted to the floor in perfect rows because chaos, even in furniture form, was unacceptable. Children arrived early, walking mostly. Some rode bikes, others came in wagons or streetcars. School buses existed, but not everywhere. Attendance depended on weather, distance, and whether your family needed you at home that day. The school bell rang with final authority. Once inside, time belonged to the schedule. The day began with routine, standing, sitting, opening books, closing them again, repeating facts aloud in unison, because nothing says education like synchronized memorization. Teachers were respected without negotiation. They were often young women, paid very little, expected to remain unmarried, and entrusted with managing dozens of children using nothing but posture, tone, and an unshakable sense of purpose. They didn't smile much, not because they were cruel, but because smiling too much might invite chaos, and chaos was not on the curriculum. Lessons were direct: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography. No electives, no exploration of feelings, no group projects involving poster boards and glitter. Students copied notes from the blackboard, slowly, carefully. Cursive mattered. Sloppy handwriting was interpreted as a personal failure. Mistakes were corrected publicly, quietly but publicly. You learned quickly not to volunteer unless you were confident, or at least convincingly calm. Recess existed, but it was brief. Children spilled outside like released steam, running, shouting, and expending energy as fast as possible before being summoned back into stillness. Lunch was simple: sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, apples, hard-boiled eggs, sometimes soup in a thermos. No vending machines, no cafeteria choices. You ate what you brought, or you went hungry. Afternoons stretched long. Chairs grew uncomfortable. Minds wandered. Windows offered glimpses of freedom, clouds, birds, people passing by, while inside, multiplication tables marched on relentlessly. And yet, despite the rigidity, school was often the most stable place in a child's life.
Now that school is let out, at least for those lucky enough to still be attending, it's time to follow the adults, quietly, from a respectful distance. Because work in 1925 was not something you explored, it was something you did. Most Americans worked because there was no alternative. Employment wasn't about fulfillment or passion. It was about food, rent, coal, and staying just slightly ahead of disaster. Let's start in the morning. People woke early, very early. Alarm clocks existed, but many relied on habit, daylight, or the internal knowledge that being late was not an option. Breakfast was simple: coffee, bread, maybe eggs, something warm, something fast.
Then they left. Men in hats, women in sensible dresses, lunch pails in hand, faces already tired before the day began. Factories were loud, crowded, and relentless. Machines ran all day. Belts turned. Steam hissed. The air smelled like oil, metal, and sweat. Work was repetitive. You did the same motion thousands of times, hoping nothing went wrong. Safety regulations were improving, but slowly. Injuries were common. Fingers were lost. Backs were ruined. And if you couldn't work, you didn't get paid. Simple math. Supervisors watched closely. Breaks were short. Talking was discouraged. Efficiency was praised. Loyalty was expected. Office jobs existed, but they weren't glamorous. Typing pools, filing rooms, accounting desks, endless paperwork. Men dominated management. Women filled clerical roles, often temporarily until marriage redirected their lives. Dress codes were strict. Appearance mattered. A messy desk reflected a messy character, or so everyone believed. Hours were long, 9, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. Overtime existed, but it wasn't always compensated fairly. Complaints were risky. Jobs were replaceable. People were too. On farms, work never really stopped. Animals didn't care about weekends. Crops demanded constant attention. Weather ruled everything. Farm families rose with the sun. Children worked alongside parents. Seasons dictated pace. Good years were generous. Bad years were devastating.
All right, let's sit at the table for a bit. Not literally, you can stretch your legs, but imagine the smells, the sounds, and the slow rhythms of a 1925 meal. Breakfast started early. Coffee for adults, warm milk for children. Bread, sometimes toasted. Eggs when affordable or when hens were generous. Occasionally, leftovers from yesterday. Nothing wasted, nothing fancy. Efficiency reigned supreme. Families ate together whenever possible. Conversation was minimal. Manners mattered. You didn't complain about the food, you ate it. You survived. Lunch was often a midday pause from work. In cities, sandwiches, fruit, or leftovers carried from home. In rural areas, a simple hot meal, bread, cheese, sometimes a bit of meat if available. Children and workers alike ate quickly, returned to their duties, and accepted the monotony. Dinner was the main event, not elaborate by modern standards, but considered the central gathering of the day. Meat was served when possible, chicken, beef, pork, depending on season, luck, and budget. Vegetables, often homegrown, filled the gaps. Potatoes were universal. Bread was plentiful. Desserts were occasional rewards. Cooking required skill, patience, and endurance. Kitchens were small, functional, and often hot from wood stoves or early gas ranges. Labor was continuous. Meals were prepared carefully, eaten politely, and cleaned up thoroughly. Eating habits reflected practicality. Portions were reasonable. No snacking between meals, except maybe a slice of bread or a handful of fruit. Calories mattered because food wasn't guaranteed. Wasting anything was unthinkable. Markets supplied cities and towns with fresh produce, dairy, and meats. Refrigeration was improving, but ice boxes were still common. People planned meals to avoid spoilage. Food preservation, canning, pickling, drying was routine. Restaurants existed, mostly in cities. They were simple. Steaks, soups, pies. People went occasionally, not regularly. Dining out was a minor event, not a lifestyle. Tea and coffee were central beverages. Soda existed, though mostly in urban soda fountains. Beer and spirits were present, but limited by prohibition. Drinking was careful, polite, and usually secretive when illegal. Families often followed seasonal menus. Spring, fresh vegetables and lamb. Summer, corn, tomatoes, fruits.
fall, squash, root vegetables, preserved foods. Winter, potatoes, cabbage, stored fruit, and dried meats. Meals reflected what was available, practical, and minimally luxurious. Food rituals created rhythm: morning coffee, midday pause, evening dinner, occasional treats. The pattern itself offered comfort. Life could be chaotic, but meals were steady, predictable, reliable. Even small indulgences, pies, cakes, cookies, were treasured. They were rare. Sweetness was a reward, not a given. And so, in 1925, Americans ate not for excitement, but for survival, health, and modest pleasure. Meals grounded the day, reminding everyone that life, however repetitive, continued steadily.
Now let's drift away from work, chores, and meals and float toward the quieter side of life in 1925 America. Life wasn't all labor and responsibility. There were pockets of calm, places where people could breathe, think, or simply exist without deadlines, bosses, or bells dictating every movement. These were the spaces of leisure, the gentle pauses between obligation and sleep. Reading was perhaps the most common and unhurried pastime. Newspapers arrived daily, carefully folded, ink still faintly smudged. Adults read them slowly, over coffee or after supper, absorbing information, politics, social events, or the occasional mildly dramatic story from a neighboring town. Magazines offered glimpses of fashion, science, or hobbies. Novels transported readers gently to other worlds, but at the pace of walking, not running. No one raced through pages. Reading was measured, intentional, reflective. Music filled homes in quiet but consistent ways. Pianos were central in middle-class households. Children learned scales and simple songs, often under the stern supervision of parents who believed that patience and finger dexterity were moral virtues. Adults hummed while washing dishes or scrubbing floors, the music floating softly around the house. Sheet music allowed entire families to attempt small, informal performances together, some harmonious, others less so, but all treated as acceptable effort. Radios were slowly changing the landscape. Families gathered around large wooden boxes in the evenings. Programs varied: orchestras, serialized dramas, or lectures about faraway places. The sound was sometimes scratchy, voices occasionally warbled, but that was part of the charm. Listeners learned patience. The shows started when they started, and you simply adjusted your expectations. Listening to a radio program became a communal experience, a quiet ritual that connected neighbors, families, and strangers to the same stories at the same time. Outdoor activity remained central. Children ran, climbed, skipped, or explored streets and fields with minimal supervision. Adults walked, gardened, fished, or rode horses if they could. Exercise was incidental, embedded in the rhythm of daily life. Chores, errands, and travel provided movement more than intention. Parks were places to gather, sit, and watch life pass in a controlled, predictable manner. Hobbies were deliberate, slow, and required patience. Needlework, embroidery, or knitting were common for women. Men might carve wood, tinker with machinery, or sketch quietly. Collecting stamps, coins, or other curiosities offered small, structured joy. People focused on one activity at a time, gradually building skill and knowledge.